So for those who have just arrived, welcome to Keshet's webinar on trans rights, where we'll be talking about this November's ballot initiative. The way that we are going to do question and answer is that everybody will have the opportunity to submit a question throughout the presentation by clicking on the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll answer them at the end. And if you have any technical issues or technology-related questions, you can individually message Catherine through the chat function. Let's see. Sure, so thank you, Amy, for this message. So if you have a technical issue, please send a message in the chat to all panelists. Thanks. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And the way that we'll start is just to lay out a little bit about the goals of this particular webinar. So one of the goals is to give detailed information about the ballot initiative that's coming up in November, how we got here, the issue at hand, why this is happening in Massachusetts, etc. We're going to be talking for a minute about why this is an issue of concern in the Jewish community. And then we're going to talk a little bit about action opportunities that each of you have individually and as members of congregations or Jewish institutions to be part of the effort to engage voters to vote yes on the ballot in November to uphold trans rights. And what we really hope for is that this webinar will give you as much information as you need in order to take action and to feel confident in being able to take action. So please do submit your questions through the Q&A function. We do want to give as much information as possible so you feel as knowledgeable as you need to be. So at that, I will go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Kaden Muhammad.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us. So I want to start us off by talking about how we got here. So before 2016, there were no statewide anti-discrimination laws protecting transgender people in public spaces. So there were 12 cities around the state that had their own local ordinances, which gave trans people protections. Some of those cities were Boston, Cambridge, Northampton, and Amherst. But that was only 12 cities, which, as you can imagine, represents a very small minority of places in our state. There were still millions of people at risk every day. And if someone left Boston, for example, and went to another part of the state, even just a 20 or 30-minute drive down the road to a town like Wellesley, they would not be safe or protected from discrimination in public spaces. So what that means really is that transgender people could be kicked out of or refused service in places like restaurants and parks and public transportation and grocery stores, and even in medical care facilities like doctor's offices and hospitals. So back in July of 2016, we were able to get a bipartisan supermajority of legislators to pass the anti-discrimination bill that now gives transgender people protections in public spaces from discrimination. It was also signed into law by Governor Charlie Baker. So after long-term efforts of organizing, building a coalition of individuals and organizations who supported the bill, countless conversations with legislators, the Freedom for All Massachusetts campaign and its partners, including Keshet, were able to get the statewide legislation passed. The anti-discrimination law that I'm talking about now is what's at risk in November when people go and vote on the ballot initiative. Can you go on? Sorry. So by the end of October of 2016, a small group of people had gotten enough signatures to put this legislation up for repeal by popular vote. So there are a few things to note about this that are important to know. It's the first time that there's ever going to be a statewide popular vote for transgender people from discrimination anywhere in the country. This has never happened before. It means that people's basic human rights and this anti-discrimination law are going to be put up for a vote in our state, questioning whether or not trans people should have basic rights. People will get to check a box, basically, and decide if an entire group of people should be treated fairly and equally under the law, or if our state is going to allow them to be second-class citizens subjected to discrimination every time they leave their homes, and try to do anything from getting on the T to getting groceries. So what this means for November. So in November, the most important thing to know is that we need to vote yes to uphold transgender rights and uphold this legislation that provides people protections in public spaces. This is not an easy win for us. Recent polling shows that currently only about 50% of Massachusetts voters support upholding these protections. There's up to 10% of voters that are undecided. So there's a large area there for us to lose this vote. And so it's really important to remember that this is not easy. We cannot, take this for granted, even though we're living in Massachusetts, which is a liberal state. We really need to be vigilant about making sure that everybody knows about this and that everybody knows that we need to actually go to the polls and vote yes in November. Another part of the challenge between now and November is that the language can be somewhat confusing. So as I've said a few times, I'm going to keep saying it throughout the presentation, we really need to make sure that we're voting yes. If there's one thing that you take away from tonight, make sure that that you need to vote yes for trans rights, vote yes to uphold dignity and respect for trans people, vote yes to keep this law in place. So there's oftentimes a myth about this type of legislation that it increases a threat to public safety for everybody else. That is in fact a myth. There has been no increase in public safety incidents since this law was put into place anywhere in the state since 2016. In Boston, there have been, as I said, there's been a local ordinance in place since 2002, so that's 16 years, and there were no incidences in the past 16 years of public safety concerns because of these protections for trans people. Even though this law is being put into question, it's been enforced since October 1st of 2016, so this is really a chance for us to stand up again and show that Massachusetts is a place where discrimination will not be allowed. There's no evidence in Massachusetts or the other 18 states and more than 100 cities across the country that this type of legislation increases public safety concerns for anybody. There's been no increase of harassment in any type of public spaces, including bathrooms, which is often what people like to focus on with this type of legislation. It does not allow anybody the right to assault or harass people. There are already laws in place that protect us from that. All this law is doing is providing transgender people the opportunity to go and live their lives in public without fear of being kicked out or refused service when they're trying to eat at a restaurant or see a movie in a movie theater or go to the hospital because they broke their arm. So why Massachusetts? There are a few reasons why the opposition picked Massachusetts. It was a very intentional one. It's much easier in Massachusetts to get something put on the ballot than it is in other states. It only requires for this type of ballot question for a veto referendum, it only requires about 32,000 signatures in this state. That's, out of our population of about 6 million people. So that's a very small percentage of the state population that needs to sign the petition to put this on the ballot. So it was a targeted attack, knowing that it would be easy to get that put on a ballot and up for the vote in Massachusetts. Equally important to note is that Massachusetts has always been a leader for LGBTQ rights and equality. If we lose ground on trans rights here, it really does not send a good message to other states and other cities, especially less LGBTQ-friendly states. It's telling them that it's okay to discriminate and that it's okay to take away basic human rights from an entire group of individuals. Beyond that, it sends a message to people across the country that it's acceptable to discriminate against trans people, and it puts trans people at even greater risk than we already are to things like verbal harassment. And, it could even lead to more physical violence towards trans people if we are sending the message to people that it's okay to treat trans folks differently and to treat us as second-class citizens. So it's, again, really important that we do this not only for Massachusetts to make sure that we're upholding trans rights here, but also to set an example for the rest of the country by voting yes to make sure that we're standing up for trans rights and trans dignity in our state. So just to reiterate a little bit, I believe personally, and I think that hopefully most of you on this webinar believe as well, that transgender people deserve to live our lives without constant fear and with the same rights as everybody else. And at the end of the day, that's really what this legislation is about. One of the things that I like to emphasize for people is that this law affects trans people on an everyday basis, on a consistent basis. Here's an example of just an average day where a trans person would be at risk of discrimination without this law. They wake up, they commute to work on the T, maybe they stop by a cafe to get a coffee before work, they go out to a lunch meeting with a coworker at a restaurant, perhaps they go stop at the gym after work, and then they go to the grocery store to grab some food for dinner, and then they commute back home on the T. Along almost every single step of that person's day, they would be open to discrimination. Maybe they would be made late to work because they got kicked off of the first bus they caught. They would be at risk of being removed and humiliated when they try to buy that cup of coffee. They could be denied access to the gym or thrown out when trying to buy groceries. So having this law gave me personally as a trans person and a lot of other trans people peace of mind. It gave us a sense of feeling like it's okay for us to be in public spaces. It affirmed that we're allowed to exist. And it helps to begin alleviate some of the fears that the trans community experiences when it comes to living our lives out in the world. Nobody should be afraid to do the things that I listed before. Nobody should have anxiety about being able to walk outside of their house and live with the worry of what would happen if they were taken to a hospital in an emergency, worry that they might not receive the treatment that they need. So voting yes to protect trans rights, voting yes to keep this law shows the trans community that Massachusetts is a place that values human lives and sees us, trans people, as human. It shows the trans community that Massachusetts stands for equality. It shows us that we do not have to hide away and limit ourselves, that we can go about our daily lives and be protected from discrimination just like everybody else is in our state. So voting yes shows that Massachusetts will remain a welcoming place that values everyone regardless of their gender, and it sets an example for the rest of the country. So it's really important that we all talk about this with our friends, talk about this with our neighbors, make sure that we're explaining to people that this is really just about human dignity and human rights. This is about giving people equal protections. This is about making sure that trans people are able to go about their daily lives without living in constant fear, without potentially being discriminated against multiple times a day, every day, when they're in places that are public spaces. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mimi. She's going to talk a little bit more about why this is a Jewish issue.
Great. Thanks, Kaden. I think in addition to what Kaden says, I think we have a responsibility as a Jewish community to engage on this issue and to work hard to make sure that the law is upheld at the ballot in November. And, I feel like we could talk about why our tradition might mandate us to do this. I feel like we could talk about why Jewish values mandate us to do this. And I also think we could talk about how, the kind of Jewish history of exclusion from public places and institutions all over the United States should ensure that we stand with transgender folks as well. But I want to sort of make two additional insights on this. One is that I think very, very simply, we have a responsibility to trans Jews. We have a responsibility to those trans Jews who are in our community who are going to be specifically targeted by this ballot initiative in November and will specifically be at a loss of rights if we lose. I also want to sort of talk a little bit about strategy and numbers for a moment. So we in Massachusetts are somewhere around 250,000 Jews. And we know that there is about a 10% undecided rate in Massachusetts about whether to repeal the law or uphold the law. So we actually have a significant amount of numbers to ensure that the vote goes one way or another. It could be the Jewish community that sways the vote into the yes camp and allows the laws to be upheld. We have that power. So what if we were able to get the majority of the Jewish community in Massachusetts to vote yes? That could mean a win. That could mean that the law remains in place. So we have a strategic duty as well, I believe. So now we want to talk a little bit about how each of us can help, both as individuals on this campaign and as communities, congregations, and Jewish organizations. Now, I'd say overall, the strategy both of our work at Keshet, but of the kind of larger campaign that is really in charge of the Vote Yes effort, which is called the Freedom for All Massachusetts campaign, is to engage and educate as many Massachusetts voters as possible about the law and about why the law should remain in place and why people should vote yes on the ballot in November. It's also, the strategy is also about humanizing the issue and helping folks understand what it means to be trans. So we at Keshet have a number of action opportunities that we want to invite you to participate in, and really we want to urge you to participate in. The first is that we want to ask you to sign Keshet's Jewish Community Vote Yes Pledge. And what this means when you sign it is that you are committing to voting yes on the ballot in November to uphold trans rights. Besides that, we would want to ask you to send this pledge to other people in your community, whether it's people in your synagogue through a listserv, through a newsletter, or people in your own personal networks in the Jewish community. We urge you to send the pledge to others and have them sign on. We also want to urge you to incorporate Keshet and the Religious Action Center's High Holiday resource materials into your community's High Holiday programming. This resource contains everything from pieces of liturgy to sermon starters to ready-made text studies so that your community has the opportunity to bring in the campaign into High Holiday services easily and meaningfully. There are also a number of specific events that we want you to know about. One is that every Thursday evening from 6 to 9 p.m., there is phone banking run by Freedom for All Massachusetts in the Keshet office in Jamaica Plain. In addition, we really want to urge you to attend the Jewish Community Canvas Day on Sunday, July 29th, which is sponsored by Keshet, the Jewish Community Relations Council, and the Religious Action Center, and it's going to be in Newton from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And canvassing, we believe, is deeply important because that is the moment where you get to have the face-to-face conversation with people. You get to talk about what it really means to be trans, what the law is really about. It's a moment to sort of deal with people's misconceptions or concerns. It's a very, very powerful experience and a powerful way to engage voters. So we really urge you to attend that, and RSVP is on this link that you see on the PowerPoint. As well, Keshet will be involved in some Get Out the Vote efforts in October and early November, so stay tuned for ways to get involved in that. And finally, if you are interested in organizing your congregation or Jewish organization to engage voters and be involved in this campaign, please be in touch with me at mimi@keshetonline.org. So that concludes this portion of the presentation. Now we will be moving into the question and answer part of this webinar. And we look forward to answering some of the questions that you have asked.
All right, my name is Rachel, and I'm going to be moderating Q&A. So if you haven't sent in any questions, you can do so now. First, somebody asked if there's a way to send this out to your congregation. So I'll just say there is. We are recording this and it will be on YouTube, so you can send it out. Okay, first question. Shira wants to know if transgender also includes non-binary and genderqueer folks as well.
Yes, it does. So the way that the law is written, it is to protect people who are transgender, but it is written in a way that also protects people based on gender identity. So it's gender identity and gender expression. So you're right, it's not necessarily true that you would know if somebody is really trans, but if you're discriminating against that person based on how they're presenting their gender, whether they're trans or not, that is also part of it. So it does include people who are non-binary. It includes, I have heard stories of some queer women who have experienced harassment for being in a space because they're getting read as being trans in some way as well. So it protects people based on gender identity and gender expression in public spaces.
Great. Next, Nina asks if the RAC programming is coordinated with Freedom for All State Outreach Week of Action.
The Religious Action Center is, in general, coordinating both with us at Keshet and with the Freedom for All Massachusetts campaign. So, any kind of faith-related work that Freedom for All Massachusetts is doing, the Religious Action Center is sort of in conversation with Freedom for All Massachusetts about their contributions to that.
Nina also asks if we will have a written summary of action items at the end.
Well, we're recording this webinar, and so we're going to send it out. There were some written action items on the last few slides, so you will have access to those. And there's more information on the Freedom for All Massachusetts website, as well as, you can always be in contact with Mimi, who can give you more action steps that are more detailed if the ones that are on this PowerPoint are not helpful for you.
And we can also send out that list from the PowerPoint to all webinar attendees as well.
Rabbi Ileana asks if there are particular towns that we feel there is a larger chance to encounter people who are undecided than others.
Great. In my conversation with the Freedom for All Massachusetts campaign, their focus is really in the Boston area and the Boston suburbs, Worcester, Springfield, and sort of the Northampton area. Also, interestingly enough, the reason that we're doing our Canvas Day in Newton is that the campaign has identified Newton as a place with a good amount of undecided voters. So in that 10% of people who could swing the vote one way or the other. Hope that answers the question.
Great. Last question is from Crystal. They ask what possible next steps there are to protect trans people and trans rights in MA if the repeal happens.
Yeah, so if the repeal does happen, at that point it would mean going back to what we did in 2016 already and working with legislators to get this passed through the House and the Senate in Massachusetts. So basically it would mean doing the work that we have already done and working with legislators, many of whom we have already worked with, to get this back onto get this legislation put back up through the legislature. And then, hopefully it would not be put up for a repeal again. The language could not be exactly the same just because of how that works, but it would, basically that would be the process we would have to go through, is we would have to write another bill and go through the process of turning the bill into a law.
Leslie asks if we have call lists for when we do phone banks.
Yeah, so the way that phone banks work is that you go to the Freedom for All Massachusetts website, and if you're phone banking individually, you click a button that says sign up to make calls, and then you sign up for a shift, and you will sort of tune in at that time. You will receive a training on how to do the phone banking, and then you will be given the list of folks to call. If you want to organize a phone bank in your congregation or even in your home, just gathering a group of people, you can click organize a phone bank, and an administrator from the service that puts together the phone bank will be in touch with you and will sort of help you through all of the logistics, the technical logistics of making it happen. And that again would include the list of people to call. So it's quite, they make it very, very simple.
Matt wants to know who our coalition members are.
Well, Keshet's coalition members are different than Freedom for All Massachusetts. Freedom for All Massachusetts has tons of people that are part of their coalition. I think that they have like over 1,000 organizations signed on in support of this legislation, but specific to Keshet, there are a few organizations that we're working with.
Yes, so, and the Freedom for All Massachusetts website has a section on it with all of the different coalitions, and you can look at all of the organizations. I believe there's over 1,000 partner organizations at this point. Keshet specifically is working closely with the Religious Action Center, with JALSA, with the Jewish Community Relations Council, as well as the ADL. I also want to just respond to Panina, your response to our question. So Panina's question is about something that the Freedom for All Massachusetts campaign, their faith organizer, is working on planning, which is kind of a faith week of action where all of the faith communities in Massachusetts sort of take action in the same week, and they're in the process of deciding whether that's going to be in September or whether that's going to be in October. In my last conversation with them earlier this week, that's what they said. And so that's in the process of being planned, and once that's a little bit more fleshed out, we will hear more information about how we in the Jewish community can plug in to that.
Lori also wants to know what specific points we can use to persuade Jews in different denominations that are maybe less progressive on LGBT issues.
So I'll say a few things on that. On the last point of progressive Jews aren't a group that maybe needed to be persuaded, I think what we've been sort of surprised by in conversations across the state is the number of people who articulate a concern about bathroom safety, be they Democrats, be they Republicans, and so perhaps progressive Jews are part of that, but I think we shouldn't necessarily assume that people don't have that concern, just given the number of people who have articulated that concern. But I think with more Orthodox or perhaps some more conservative Jews, I mean, I think it's worth trying to hear what their particular concerns are. There's just a number of concerns that are possible. If it's a concern about sort of the place of transgender folks in the Jewish community, I think there's a conversation to be had about the Jewish value of inclusion. I think if people are saying there's something sort of Jewishly wrong about any gender that is not sort of cis male or cis female, then you can have a conversation with them about the 6 genders actually that we find in the Talmud, and how the rabbis in the Talmud were very, very comfortable with multiple gender expressions, and were much more concerned about what people's sort of practical obligations were depending on their gender expression. So those are places potentially to start with folks, as well as, again, I could imagine a number of folks who are in less progressive Jewish denominations would also have the bathroom safety concern, just given that that's been the concern of so many folks. And I think Kaden did a nice job of articulating how you might respond to that.
And I'll just add one thing, that it's not necessarily about needing to persuade people that you consider to be progressive, as much as it is about educating them and making sure that they know the right way to vote. As I said before, the language around this ballot question can be very confusing for people. it's hard for some people to know whether or not they're supposed to be voting yes or no based on how the language is written. And there are a lot of people who don't know that this is going to be on the ballot. So even the folks who you know in their heart of hearts would be voting yes might not know that they need to go vote yes. So that's also something to keep in mind, is that it's not just about needing to persuade people, although that is part of it, but the other part of it is making sure that everyone knows that this is happening and knows that they need to say yes.
If we have another minute, Crystal would like to hear about these 6 genders in the Talmud.
Excellent. I'm a rabbinical student, so my heart is just sort of soaring right now. I will follow up with you. Off the top of my head, I couldn't do as much justice to it as I would want to, but I'm happy to follow up individually and share more information about that. You can also find this information on the Keshet website under our resource bank. We have like a number of text studies that have been made that articulates, that talks about these different genders. So yes, I'm happy to follow up.
And Shira made a great point as well, that when talking to less progressive Jews or anybody, regardless of how progressive they are, it's not necessarily only progressive people who support this, and it's not necessarily only more conservative people who don't support it. So regardless of whether you're talking to somebody who's progressive or not, it's important to note that whether they know it or not, there could be trans people, gender binary people in their families and in their communities. So thank you so much, Shira, for making that point. That does really help to make it more personal, is that there might be somebody in your congregation or somebody at your kid's day school or somebody living on your street who's transgender, and this law affects those people. And if those people are important to you as members of your community, then it's important for you to support this legislation. So I don't see any more questions right now in our Q&A thread, but if anybody else has any questions, feel free to type them in now.
And while we wait for that, just a reminder that you can be in touch with me here at Keshet at mimi@keshetonline.org. If you have any further questions about the presentation, if you want to get involved personally, if you want to get involved and get your congregation or Jewish organization involved, please be in touch with me. I would love to help you think about how to do that. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for, I'm sorry, hold on.
Leslie has a question about